In the dusty saloons of 1880s Montana, where fortunes changed hands faster than bullets left their chambers, one poker game would alter the course of two lives forever. What started as another night of cards and whiskey ended with a desperate father wagering the most precious thing he owned, his own daughter. But, sometimes, the greatest gambles lead to the most unexpected redemption. This is the true story of how a broken cowboy named Samuel Hart found salvation in the most unlikely place, and how a young woman named Elizabeth discovered that freedom sometimes comes from the most unexpected circumstances. It's a tale of second chances, where love bloomed from the ashes of desperation, and where the Wild West's harshest realities gave birth to its most beautiful truths. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves and distant snow across the Montana Territory as Samuel Hart guided his horse through the narrow streets of Silver Creek. His weathered hands gripped the reins with the same steadiness that had once made him the most respected ranch foreman in 3 counties, but those days felt like a lifetime ago. Now, at 35, Sam was little more than a drifter, moving from town to town, taking whatever work he could find to keep body and soul together. The weight of his past pressed down on him like the heavy clouds gathering overhead. 3 years had passed since the accident that claimed his wife Sarah and their unborn child, 3 years since his world collapsed in a single moment of twisted metal and shattered dreams. The stagecoach accident had been nobody's fault, the sheriff had said, just one of those terrible things that happen when horses spook and wheels catch in ruts. But, knowing that didn't make the pain any easier to bear, didn't fill the hollow ache in his chest that no amount of whiskey seemed to numb. Sam had tried to go back to ranching after the funeral, tried to lose himself in the familiar routines of cattle and horses, but every sunrise reminded him of mornings spent with Sarah, every sunset of evenings planned with their child. The ranch house had become a mausoleum of memories, each room echoing with ghosts of laughter and dreams that would never be. Finally, he'd sold everything and taken to the road, hoping distance might heal what time could not. Silver Creek was just another stop on his aimless journey, a mining town that had seen better days but still offered work for a man with his skills. The mines needed horses transported, and Sam knew horses better than most men knew their own names. He'd heard about the job from a trader in the last town, steady work for a month or two while the mine expanded their operations. It wasn't much, but it was honest work, and honest work was all Sam asked for these days. As he rode down Main Street, Sam took in the familiar sights of a frontier town trying to civilize itself. False-fronted buildings lined both sides of the dusty thoroughfare, their fresh paint already beginning to fade under the harsh Montana sun. The general store displayed its wares in a large window, bolts of fabric and tools competing for space with jars of penny candy and patent medicines. A barbershop pole spun lazily in the breeze, while across the street, the Silver Dollar Saloon's batwing doors swung open and closed as men wandered in and out, seeking refuge from their daily troubles. Sam dismounted in front of McGrath's livery stable, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a soft thud. His horse, a reliable bay gelding named Buck, snorted and shook his head, eager for the promise of hay and rest. The stable owner, a grizzled man in his 60s with kind eyes and calloused hands, emerged from the shadows of the barn. "You'd be Samuel Hart, I reckon," the man said, extending a weathered hand. "Tom McGrath. Got word you might be coming through, looking for work." Sam shook the offered hand, grateful for the firm grip and direct manner. In his experience, a man's handshake told you everything you needed to know about his character, and Tom McGrath spoke of honesty and reliability. "That's right. Heard you might need someone to help with the mine's horse transport." "Indeed I do," McGrath replied, taking Buck's reins and leading the horse toward a stall. "Been handling it myself for years, but these old bones aren't what they used to be, and the mine's expanding faster than I can keep up. Job pays decent, includes a room above the stable, and 3 meals a day. Nothing fancy, mind you, but clean and honest." The offer was more generous than Sam had expected, and he felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. Clean lodging and regular meals were luxuries he'd learned not to take for granted in his wandering years. "Sounds fair to me. When do I start?" "Tomorrow morning, if you're willing. Give you today to get settled and acquainted with the town. Might want to introduce yourself to Sheriff Morrison, let him know you're here on legitimate business. Some folks get nervous about strangers, especially ones who look like they can handle themselves in a fight." Sam nodded, understanding the wisdom in the suggestion. His years on the range had left him lean and hard, with the quiet confidence of a man who'd faced down angry bulls and hostile weather. His weathered leather vest and well-worn Colt revolver marked him as someone who'd seen his share of trouble, even though he'd never been the type to go looking for it. After seeing to Buck's care and moving his few belongings to the small but clean room above the stable, Sam decided to walk through town and get his bearings. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street as he made his way toward the sheriff's office, a solid brick building that spoke of the town's aspirations toward permanence and respectability. Sheriff Morrison turned out to be a man in his late 40s with prematurely gray hair and the careful eyes of someone who'd learned to read trouble before it announced itself. He listened to Sam's introduction with polite attention, asked a few questions about his background and intentions, then seemed satisfied with the answers. "McGrath's a good man," the sheriff said, leaning back in his chair. "Honest as they come, and he's needed help for a while now. You'll find Silver Creek's a decent town, mostly. We've got the usual collection of miners, merchants, and working folks trying to make their way in the world. Most trouble we get is Saturday night foolishness at the saloon, nothing a man like yourself can't handle if you mind your own business." As Sam left the sheriff's office, he felt more optimistic about his prospects than he had in months. The work would be familiar, the pay fair, and the town seemed stable enough to provide the peace he desperately needed. Maybe here, in this small mining community surrounded by mountains and sky, he could finally find some measure of healing from the wounds that had driven him from his home. But, as he passed the Silver Dollar Saloon on his way back to the livery, the sound of raucous laughter and clinking glasses drifted through the batwing doors, along with something else that made him pause. A woman's voice, clear and sweet despite the underlying note of sadness, was singing an old ballad he remembered Sarah humming while she worked in their garden. The melody stopped him in his tracks, bringing back memories so vivid he could almost smell the roses she'd planted along their front porch. Through the gap in the doors, he caught a glimpse of the singer, a young woman with auburn hair and striking green eyes, accompanying herself on an old upright piano. She was beautiful, but there was something in her expression, a resigned sadness that spoke of dreams deferred and choices made by others. She finished the song to appreciative applause from the saloon's patrons, then immediately began another tune, this one livelier and less personal. Sam stood there for a long moment, transfixed not by her beauty but by the pain he recognized in her voice. It was the same ache he carried, the same weight of loss and longing that had driven him across half the territory. Then, shaking his head at his own foolishness, he continued on to the stable. He'd come to Silver Creek to work and heal, not to get involved in other people's troubles, no matter how much their pain might mirror his own. That night, lying on the narrow cot in his room above the stable, Sam listened to the sounds of the town settling into evening quiet. Dogs barked in the distance, someone was playing a harmonica on a nearby porch, and, from the direction of the saloon came the faint sounds of ongoing revelry. But, louder than all of it was the memory of that woman's voice, singing of lost love and distant homes with an ache that spoke directly to his own broken heart. He'd thought himself beyond such feelings, had convinced himself that the part of him capable of being moved by a woman's song had died with Sarah in that overturned stagecoach. But something in the singer's voice had reached through his carefully constructed walls, touching nerves he'd thought permanently numbed by grief and whiskey. As sleep finally took him, Sam made a silent promise to himself. Tomorrow he would begin his new job, would throw himself into the familiar work of horses and harness, and would put all thoughts of sad-eyed singers out of his mind. He'd learned the hard way that caring about people only led to pain, and he had no intention of opening his heart to that kind of hurt again. But, even as he made that promise, some part of him knew it was already too late. The damage was done, the crack in his armor already made. And, in a town as small as Silver Creek, it was only a matter of time before he would learn the story behind those sad green eyes and that voice full of longing for a freedom that seemed forever out of reach. The wind picked up outside his window, rattling the glass and carrying with it the promise of winter. Change was coming to Silver Creek, Sam could feel it in the air. The only question was whether the change would bring healing or heartbreak to a man who'd already lost everything he thought he cared about. Morning would come soon enough, bringing with it the beginning of a story that would test everything Sam thought he knew about love, loss, and the possibility of second chances. But, for now, he slept, dreaming of auburn hair and green eyes, of voices raised in song, and of the dangerous hope that maybe, just maybe, his wandering days might finally be coming to an end. The last thing he heard before sleep took him completely was the distant sound of the piano at the Silver Dollar, playing a melody that seemed to speak of promises yet to be made and futures yet to be written in the vast, unforgiving, and sometimes merciful landscape of the American frontier. Elizabeth Porter had learned long ago that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. At 23, she possessed a beauty that drew men like moths to flame, but her striking auburn hair and emerald eyes had become more curse than blessing. They were assets in her father's endless calculations, chips to be played in his desperate games of chance. Tonight, as she sat at the piano in the Silver Dollar Saloon, her fingers moving automatically across the worn keys, she wondered if this would be the night her father's luck finally ran out completely. Marcus Porter had once been a respected businessman in St. Louis, a man who owned a thriving freight company and a fine house on the good side of town. Elizabeth remembered those days with the painful clarity of someone who'd lost paradise and never stopped grieving for it. She remembered silk dresses and dancing lessons, books and tutors, and, most of all, her mother's gentle laugh filling their sunlit parlor. But that was before the cards became more important than cargo, before gambling fever consumed the man who'd once read her bedtime stories and promised her the world. The slow destruction had taken 3 years. First went the business, sold piece by piece to cover mounting debts. Then, the house, the furniture, even her mother's jewelry, everything sacrificed on the altar of Marcus's certainty that the next hand would be the one to save them all. Elizabeth's mother had tried to hold the family together through sheer force of will and love, but the strain proved too much. She died of a weak heart and broken spirit in a shabby boarding house room, leaving her daughter alone with a man who saw everything in terms of odds and stakes. That had been 4 years ago, and, since then, Elizabeth's life had become an endless series of dusty frontier towns and dimly lit saloons. She sang for her supper while Marcus played cards in back rooms, always chasing the one big score that would restore their fortune and their respectability. But, with each move, each desperate gamble, they'd sunk deeper into a world where women like Elizabeth were bought and sold as easily as cattle or mining claims. She'd tried to leave more than once, had saved enough money from her performances to buy a ticket back east, but Marcus always found out before she could escape. Sometimes he'd weep and promise to change, other times he'd fly into rages that left her cowering in corners. But, always, he'd remind her that she was all he had left in the world, that without her, he'd surely drink himself to death or put a bullet in his head. The guilt of those words kept her chained more securely than any lock ever could. Tonight felt different, though. There was a desperation in her father's manner that went beyond his usual pre-game nervousness. He'd been drinking more heavily than usual, and, when he'd kissed her forehead before heading to his game, his hands had been shaking worse than she'd ever seen them. The other players in tonight's poker game were men she recognized but didn't know personally, rough-looking characters who'd blown into town with the last cattle drive and showed no signs of moving on. Elizabeth finished her current song, a melancholy ballad about lost love that seemed appropriate for her mood, and acknowledged the scattered applause with a wan smile. The saloon was less crowded than usual for a Thursday night, just a handful of miners nursing beers and a few cowboys still flush with pay from the autumn roundup. At a corner table, 3 men sat hunched over their cards, while a 4th chair remained empty, waiting for her father's return from whatever business had called him away. As if summoned by her thoughts, Marcus Porter pushed through the batwing doors, his face flushed with whiskey and something that might have been panic. He was a handsome man still, despite the ravages of drink and worry. His silver hair was neatly combed, his clothes pressed and proper, maintaining the facade of respectability even as his world crumbled around him. But Elizabeth knew him too well to be fooled by appearances. She could see the tremor in his hands, the wild look in his eyes that spoke of a man standing at the edge of an abyss. He made his way to the corner table without looking in her direction, settling into the empty chair with the careful movements of someone trying not to appear as drunk as they actually were. The other men greeted him with nods and comments Elizabeth couldn't hear over the piano, but she could see the tension in their postures, the way they leaned forward slightly like wolves scenting wounded prey. Elizabeth knew she should look away, should focus on her music and let whatever was about to happen play out without witnessing it, but some awful fascination kept her watching. She'd seen her father lose before, had watched him gamble away their last dollar more times than she could count, but something about tonight felt final in a way that made her stomach clench with dread. The game progressed with the slow intensity of a building storm. Cards were dealt, bets placed, faces studied for tells and weaknesses. Elizabeth played softly, her music providing a melancholy soundtrack to the drama unfolding in the corner. She watched her father's stack of chips dwindle steadily, saw the beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool evening air. Then came the hand that would change everything. Elizabeth saw her father look at his cards and go very still, the way a rabbit freezes when it catches sight of a hawk. For a moment, hope flared in his eyes, the dangerous hope of a gambler who thinks he's finally been dealt the miracle he's been waiting for. The betting began conservatively, each man testing the waters, but as the hand progressed, the stakes climbed higher and higher. When her father ran out of chips, Elizabeth held her breath, praying he would fold and walk away. Instead, she watched in horror as he reached into his jacket and pulled out the deed to their small cabin on the outskirts of town, the last piece of property they owned. The other men studied the document with the calculating eyes of men who'd learned to evaluate everything in terms of cash value. But even that wasn't enough. The pot kept growing, and Marcus kept raising, his eyes bright with the fever that had destroyed their family. When he had nothing left to bet, Elizabeth saw him hesitate, saw him look around the saloon as if searching for something, anything, to keep him in the game. His gaze fell on her, and, in that moment, Elizabeth felt her blood turn to ice. She tried to shake her head, tried to signal him to stop, but Marcus was beyond reason now, lost in the gambler's dream of the impossible comeback. She watched in growing horror as he leaned across the table and spoke in low, urgent tones to the other men. She couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. The way the men's eyes turned to her told her everything she needed to know. Her father had just wagered the only thing he had left, his daughter. The final cards were played in a tense silence broken only by the soft melody Elizabeth continued to play, her fingers moving automatically while her mind reeled with the implications of what was happening. When the last bet was called and the cards revealed, she saw her father's face crumble as his full house was beaten by 4 queens. The winner was a lean, hard-faced man named Jake Morrison, no relation to the sheriff despite the shared name. Elizabeth had seen him around town for the past week, had noticed the way he looked at her with the calculating gaze of a man pricing horseflesh. He was younger than the other players, maybe 30, with the kind of dangerous good looks that drew foolish women and the cold eyes that marked him as someone who'd kill without hesitation if crossed. Morrison stood up from the table and walked over to the piano, his boots echoing on the wooden floor with the finality of a judge's gavel. The other patrons of the saloon had noticed something was happening, and conversations had died away to a hushed murmur. Elizabeth kept playing, though her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hit the right keys. "Well, darling," Morrison said, his voice carrying the soft drawl of a man born to violence, "looks like you belong to me now. Your daddy just bet you in a poker game, and I won fair and square." Elizabeth's fingers stilled on the keys, the sudden silence in the saloon deafening. She looked across the room at her father, hoping against hope that this was some terrible joke, but Marcus couldn't meet her eyes. His shoulders were shaking with what might have been sobs or laughter, and she realized that the last thread holding their family together had finally snapped. "I don't belong to anyone," she said quietly, standing up from the piano bench with as much dignity as she could muster. "And my father had no right to wager what wasn't his to bet." Morrison's smile was cold as winter wind. "Now, that's where you're wrong, sweetheart. Your daddy signed papers making me your legal guardian, all proper and witnessed. Judge will back it up come morning, you can count on that. So you can come along peaceful like, or we can do this the hard way. Makes no difference to me either way." The saloon was dead silent now, every eye fixed on the tableau playing out before them. Elizabeth felt the weight of their stares, some sympathetic, others merely curious about how the drama would unfold. She knew she had no real choice in the matter. In the eyes of the law, women were property to be transferred from father to husband, and if Marcus had indeed signed the papers Morrison claimed, she was well and truly trapped. But, even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Elizabeth felt something else rising in her chest, a cold, hard anger that burned brighter than any fear. She'd spent 4 years watching her father destroy everything they'd once held dear, had stood by while he gambled away their security, their future, their very dignity. But this was the final straw, the ultimate betrayal that severed whatever bonds of affection and duty had kept her by his side. "Give me 5 minutes to collect my things," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. Morrison nodded graciously, as if he were a gentleman granting a reasonable request instead of a predator who'd just acquired new prey.
5 minutes, then. Don't keep me waiting.
Elizabeth walked upstairs to the small room she shared with her father, each step feeling like she was climbing to her own execution. She packed quickly, taking only her mother's Bible and a few items of clothing, leaving behind the gaudy dresses Marcus had bought her for her performances. As she folded her belongings into a small carpet bag, she could hear the low murmur of conversation starting up again in the saloon below. When she came back downstairs, Morrison was waiting by the piano, talking quietly with one of his poker companions. Her father was gone, fled into the night to nurse his shame and whatever bottle would have him. The sight of his empty chair hit her harder than she'd expected, the final confirmation that she was truly alone in the world. Morrison took her bag with what might have been courtesy in other circumstances and gestured toward the door.
Come along, darling. Got a cabin outside town where we can get better acquainted.
As they walked toward the batwing doors, Elizabeth caught sight of a man standing at the far end of the bar, nursing a whiskey and watching the proceedings with troubled eyes. He was tall and lean, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. There was something in his expression, a mixture of anger and sympathy that spoke of a man who understood injustice when he saw it. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Elizabeth saw something in his gaze that gave her the first flicker of hope she'd felt all evening. It wasn't the calculating look of a man pricing goods, or the lustful stare of someone seeing her as an object for his pleasure. Instead, she saw the simple human recognition of one wounded soul acknowledging another. Then, Morrison's hand was on her arm, guiding her toward the door, and the moment was broken. As they stepped out into the cool night air, Elizabeth looked back once at the saloon, at the warm light spilling through the windows and the sounds of conversation and laughter that spoke of normal lives being lived by normal people. She wondered if she'd ever be normal again, or if this night would mark the beginning of a new kind of hell that would make her years with Marcus seem like paradise by comparison. But, as Morrison helped her into his wagon with mocking gallantry, Elizabeth made herself a promise. She would survive whatever came next, would endure whatever trials awaited her, and, somehow, someday, she would find her way back to freedom. The wagon wheels began to turn, carrying her away from the last life she'd known and toward an uncertain future. But, even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, Elizabeth held tight to that moment of connection with the stranger at the bar. In his eyes, she'd seen proof that not all men were like Morrison or her father, that somewhere in this harsh world, there might still be someone capable of seeing her as more than a prize to be won or lost. As the lights of Silver Creek faded behind them, Elizabeth closed her eyes and began to pray for the strength to endure whatever lay ahead, and for the wisdom to recognize salvation when it finally came.
Sam Hart couldn't shake the image of those desperate green eyes from his mind.
3 days had passed since he'd witnessed the poker game that had changed Elizabeth Porter's life, and the memory haunted his waking hours and invaded his dreams. He'd tried to lose himself in work, throwing himself into the demanding routine of managing the mine's horse transport with an intensity that surprised even Tom McGrath, but nothing seemed to quiet the storm of anger and helplessness that raged in his chest. The work itself was familiar and satisfying. Each morning before dawn, Sam would harness the teams that would haul our wagons down from the mountain mines to the railroad depot 15 miles away. The horses were good stock, well-trained and reliable, and the mountain roads, while challenging, held no surprises for a man who'd spent his life working with livestock. It was honest labor that paid fair wages, exactly what he'd been hoping to find when he'd ridden into Silver Creek. But the peace he'd sought continued to elude him. Every time he delivered a load to town, every time he passed the Silver Dollar Saloon, he found himself looking for some sign of Elizabeth Porter, some indication that she was safe and well. But the saloon had hired a new piano player, a middle-aged man with a tin ear and shaking hands who murdered every song he attempted, and there was no word of the auburn-haired singer who'd disappeared into the night with Jake Morrison. The lack of information only fed Sam's growing unease. He'd made discreet inquiries, carefully casual questions posed to Tom McGrath and Sheriff Morrison, but no one seemed to know anything about Elizabeth's whereabouts or condition. Jake Morrison had been seen around town a few times, always alone, always with that cold smile that made decent folks step aside when he passed. But of Elizabeth there was no sign, and the silence surrounding her fate grew more ominous with each passing day. On the fourth morning after the poker game, Sam was loading feed sacks at the general store when he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. Two cowboys were discussing Morrison in voices they thought were too low to be overheard, but Sam's years on the range had taught him to catch whispers that might carry warnings of danger. "Heard tell Morrison's got himself a new woman out at that cabin of his," one of them was saying, a lean man with tobacco-stained teeth and cruel eyes. "Pretty little thing, from what I hear, though she don't seem too happy about her situation." "Can't say as I blame her," the second cowboy replied, shifting uncomfortably. "Morrison ain't exactly known for his gentle ways with women."
"Remember what happened to that saloon girl in Deadwood?"
"Don't know nothing about that," the first man said quickly, glancing around nervously.
"And neither do you, if you know what's good for you."
The conversation ended abruptly as the men noticed Sam standing nearby, but he'd heard enough to confirm his worst fears. Elizabeth Porter was being held against her will in Morrison's cabin, and, from the sound of things, she was in real danger. The references to Morrison's past treatment of women painted a picture that made Sam's hands clench into fists and his jaw tighten with barely controlled rage. That evening, as he sat in his room above the livery stable, Sam wrestled with a decision that could change the course of his carefully ordered new life. He could mind his own business, could focus on his work and let whatever was happening to Elizabeth Porter play out without his interference. It was the safe choice, the rational choice, the choice that would keep him from getting involved in troubles that weren't his to solve. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah's face, remembered the promises he'd made to protect and cherish her, promises that had been rendered meaningless by a moment of random tragedy. He thought of the child they'd planned to have, the daughter who might have grown up to look something like Elizabeth Porter, and he knew he couldn't stand by while an innocent woman suffered at the hands of a man like Morrison.
The decision, once made, brought with it a sense of purpose Sam hadn't felt since Sarah's death.
For the first time in 3 years, he had a reason to fight, a cause worth risking everything for. It might not bring back his wife or heal the wounds in his heart, but it might save another soul from the kind of destruction that had claimed his own happiness. The next morning, Sam asked Tom McGrath for a day off, claiming he needed to ride out and check on some horses that had gone missing from one of the remote pastures. It wasn't entirely a lie, horses did occasionally wander off, and Sam had every intention of checking the pastures on his way to Morrison's cabin. But his real purpose was reconnaissance, a chance to scout out the situation and see what he might be up against. Morrison's cabin was located about 5 miles northwest of town, tucked into a valley that provided both isolation and defensible terrain. Sam approached carefully, using the cover of timber and rocky outcroppings to get close enough to observe without being seen. What he found there filled him with both relief and renewed determination.
Elizabeth was alive, that much was immediately clear.
He caught glimpses of her moving around inside the cabin, and once he saw her step outside to draw water from the well. Even at a distance, he could see that she was unharmed, at least physically. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone who was constantly aware of being watched, but there was still a dignity in her bearing that spoke of an unbroken spirit. Morrison was there too, lounging on the cabin's front porch with a bottle and a rifle across his knees. He had the lazy confidence of a predator who felt completely secure in his territory, but Sam noted that he kept the weapon close and his eyes moving, scanning the approaches to the cabin with the wariness of a man who'd made enemies. For 3 hours, Sam watched and waited, memorizing the layout of the cabin and its surroundings, noting the patterns of Morrison's behavior and looking for weaknesses he might exploit. The cabin had only one door and 2 windows, both of which faced the front. There was a small barn behind the main building, and, beyond that, a corral where Morrison kept his horses. The terrain around the cabin was relatively open, offering little cover for an approaching rescue party. As the afternoon wore on, Sam began to formulate a plan. It would be dangerous, requiring careful timing and no small amount of luck, but it might work if he could catch Morrison off guard. The key would be creating a distraction that would draw the man away from the cabin long enough for Sam to get Elizabeth to safety. Just as he was preparing to withdraw and head back to town, Sam heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. He pressed himself deeper into the shadows as 3 riders came into view, men he recognized from the poker game that had started this whole nightmare. They dismounted in front of the cabin, and Morrison rose to greet them with the easy familiarity of old associates. From their conversation, which carried clearly in the still mountain air, Sam learned that the men were preparing to leave Silver Creek, and they wanted Morrison to come with them. There was talk of a big job waiting in Colorado, something that would pay enough to set them all up for years.
Morrison seemed interested but reluctant to leave his new prize behind.
"She ain't going nowhere," one of the men argued.
"Hell, Jake, she'll keep. You can always come back for her when the job's done."
"Maybe," Morrison replied, but Sam could hear the uncertainty in his voice.
"Or maybe I'll just bring her along. Might be nice to have some company on the trail."
The thought of Elizabeth being dragged along on whatever criminal enterprise these men were planning sent a chill down Sam's spine. If they took her with them, she might disappear forever into the vast wilderness of the frontier, another nameless victim of men who saw women as property to be used and discarded at will. The conversation continued for another hour, with Morrison's visitors trying to persuade him to make a decision about their offer. Finally, they agreed to give him until the end of the week to make up his mind. They would meet him in town on Saturday night, and if he decided to join them, they would leave Silver Creek before dawn on Sunday morning. As the three men rode away, Sam felt the weight of a deadline settling on his shoulders. He had 3 days to figure out how to rescue Elizabeth Porter from Jake Morrison's cabin, and if he failed, she might disappear forever into a nightmare from which there would be no escape. That night, back in his room above the livery stable, Sam laid out his plan with the methodical precision of a man who'd learned that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. He would need supplies, a fast horse, and a way to get Morrison away from the cabin long enough to reach Elizabeth. It would also help to have backup, someone he could trust to watch his back if things went wrong. The obvious choice was Sheriff Morrison, but Sam had his doubts about the lawman's willingness or ability to take on Jake Morrison and his associates. The sheriff was a decent man, but he was also cautious and practical, unlikely to risk his life for a woman who was legally under Morrison's guardianship. Sam would have to handle this himself, or find another ally he could count on when the moment of truth arrived. As he lay on his narrow cot, staring up at the ceiling and listening to the wind howl through the canyon, Sam thought about Sarah and the promises he'd made at her graveside. He'd sworn to honor her memory, to live the kind of life that would make her proud. For 3 years, that had meant simply surviving, drifting from place to place in a haze of grief and self-pity.
But maybe survival wasn't enough anymore.
Maybe honoring Sarah's memory meant more than just staying alive. Maybe it meant standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, fighting for the innocent and the helpless even when the odds were stacked against him. Elizabeth Porter needed a champion, and, like it or not, Sam Hart seemed to be the only one available for the job. The thought scared him more than he cared to admit. He tried so hard to avoid caring about anyone since Sarah's death, had built walls around his heart specifically to prevent this kind of emotional involvement. But, somehow, a green-eyed singer with a voice full of sorrow had managed to slip past his defenses, and now he found himself preparing to risk everything for a woman he'd never even spoken to. As sleep finally claimed him, Sam's last conscious thought was of Elizabeth's face as she'd looked back at the saloon on that terrible night. In her eyes, he'd seen a flicker of hope, a desperate faith that someone, somewhere, might come to her aid. He prayed that faith wouldn't prove to be misplaced, and that when Saturday night came, he'd be ready to be the answer to her prayers. The wind outside his window seemed to whisper of challenges ahead, of tests that would measure not just his courage and skill, but the very essence of who he was and who he chose to become. In 3 days, Sam Hart would discover whether he was still the man Sarah had fallen in love with, or if grief had hollowed him out beyond all hope of redemption. Either way, Elizabeth Porter's fate hung in the balance, and, with it, perhaps, his own chance at finding peace in a world that had taken so much and given back so little. The game was about to begin, and, this time, the stakes were higher than any poker pot ever wagered in the Silver Dollar Saloon. Saturday evening descended on Silver Creek with an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on Sam's shoulders like a physical burden. The plan he'd spent 3 days refining was as solid as he could make it, but he knew that no plan survived contact with reality unchanged. Too many variables, too many things that could go wrong, too many ways for Elizabeth Porter to end up dead if he miscalculated even slightly. Sam had spent Friday afternoon in careful preparation, gathering the supplies he'd need and making arrangements that would give them the best chance of escape once he got Elizabeth away from Morrison's cabin. He'd purchased a second horse, a strong bay mare that could carry double if necessary, and cached supplies at strategic points along the route he planned to take out of the territory. If everything went according to plan, they'd be 50 miles away before Morrison even knew she was gone. The key to the whole operation was timing, and, for that, Sam needed to know exactly when Morrison would be in town for his meeting with the other men. Through careful eavesdropping and discreet questions, he'd learned that the meeting was set for 9 o'clock at the Silver Dollar Saloon. Morrison had been seen in town earlier in the day, making purchases and arrangements for what looked like an extended journey, which confirmed that he was planning to join his associates in whatever criminal enterprise they had planned. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that reminded Sam painfully of Sarah's hair, he made his final preparations. His Colt revolver was cleaned and loaded, extra ammunition secured in his saddlebags along with food and medical supplies. Buck was rested and ready, responding to Sam's quiet commands with the intelligent cooperation of a horse that sensed important work ahead. At 8:30, Sam mounted up and rode out of Silver Creek, taking the long way around to avoid being seen heading toward Morrison's cabin. The night was clear and cool, with enough starlight to navigate by but not so bright as to make concealment impossible. Perfect weather for what he had in mind, assuming his luck held out for just a few more hours. He reached the ridge overlooking Morrison's cabin at 9:15, just as he'd planned. A single light burned in the cabin's window, and smoke rose from the chimney, but there was no sign of Morrison's horse in the corral. If his timing was right, the man would be in town by now, deep in conversation with his criminal associates and safely out of the way. Sam secured Buck to a tree well back from the ridgeline and began his descent toward the cabin on foot, moving with the careful silence he'd learned during years of hunting game that spooked at the slightest sound. Every shadow might hide a threat, every sound might herald discovery, but he forced himself to move steadily forward, knowing that hesitation now could cost Elizabeth her life. As he drew closer to the cabin, Sam could see that his information had been correct. The building appeared to be occupied by only one person, and, through the window, he caught glimpses of auburn hair catching the lamplight as Elizabeth moved around inside. She appeared to be alone, but Sam knew better than to take anything for granted when lives hung in the balance. The cabin door was solid wood with a heavy iron latch, but Sam had come prepared for that contingency. From his saddlebags, he'd taken a small pry bar that would give him the leverage he needed to force the door without making too much noise. But, as he approached the entrance, he discovered that Morrison's confidence had worked in their favor. The door was secured by nothing more than a simple wooden bar dropped across iron brackets. Sam pressed his ear to the door and listened carefully, trying to determine Elizabeth's exact location within the cabin. He could hear her moving around, but the sounds were muffled and difficult to interpret. Finally, deciding that he'd learned all he could from outside, Sam lifted the bar as quietly as possible and eased the door open just far enough to peer inside. Elizabeth was standing at the far end of the single room, folding clothes and packing them into a canvas bag. Her back was to the door, and she was humming softly to herself, the same melancholy tune Sam had heard her playing at the saloon. Even in the dim lamplight, he could see that she'd lost weight during her captivity, and there was a tension in her posture that spoke of constant vigilance and barely contained fear. Sam pushed the door open a little wider and stepped inside, his boots making almost no sound on the rough wooden floor. He was halfway across the room before Elizabeth sensed his presence and spun around, her eyes wide with terror and her mouth opening to scream. "Don't," Sam said quietly, raising one hand in a gesture of peace while keeping the other near his gun. "I'm here to help you. My name is Sam Hart, and I'm going to get you out of here." Elizabeth stared at him for a long moment, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she fought to control her breathing. Sam could see her mind working, trying to process this unexpected development and decide whether he represented salvation or just another kind of threat. "You were at the saloon," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The night of the poker game. I remember your face." "Yes," Sam confirmed, taking a careful step closer. "I saw what happened, and I've been planning how to get you away from Morrison ever since. We don't have much time. He's in town now, but he could come back at any moment." "Why?" Elizabeth asked, and Sam could hear the bewilderment in her voice. "Why would you risk yourself for a stranger?" The question hit Sam harder than he'd expected, bringing up emotions and memories he'd tried to bury along with his wife. How could he explain that seeing Elizabeth's plight had awakened something in him that he'd thought was dead forever? How could he make her understand that helping her was as much about saving himself as it was about saving her? "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply.
And, because no one else is going to do it. Elizabeth studied his face for another moment, then, nodded slowly. What do you need me to do? Sam felt a surge of relief at her acceptance. A woman who could make quick decisions under pressure would be a valuable ally in what was sure to be a dangerous escape. Pack only what you absolutely need, he told her. We have to travel light and fast. Morrison will come after us as soon as he discovers you're gone, and he knows this country better than I do. Elizabeth turned back to her bag and began selecting items with the swift efficiency of someone who'd learned to travel light. Sam moved to the window and peered out at the night, checking for any signs of approaching riders. The valley remained silent and empty, but he knew their luck wouldn't hold forever. I'm ready, Elizabeth said, shouldering her bag and moving toward the door. Sam nodded and led the way outside, pausing to listen for any sounds that might indicate they'd been discovered. The night remained quiet, with only the distant cry of a coyote breaking the silence. He guided Elizabeth toward the ridge where Buck was waiting, setting a pace that was fast enough to cover ground quickly but not so fast as to risk a fall in the darkness. They were halfway up the slope when Sam heard the sound that made his blood turn to ice, hoofbeats, approaching fast from the direction of town. Morrison was returning early, and if they didn't reach the horses soon, they'd be trapped in the open with nowhere to hide. Run, Sam whispered urgently, abandoning stealth for speed as they scrambled up the rocky slope. Behind them, the hoofbeats were getting closer, and Sam could see the faint glow of a lantern bobbing in the darkness as Morrison approached his cabin. They reached Buck just as the cabin door slammed open and Morrison's voice roared out into the night, filled with rage and disbelief. Elizabeth! You get back here right now, or I'll hunt you down and make you sorry you were ever born. Sam boosted Elizabeth onto Buck's back, then swung up behind her and spurred the horse into motion. They had perhaps a 5-minute head start, maybe less, but it would have to be enough. Buck responded magnificently, his powerful legs eating up the ground as they raced through the darkness toward the cache of supplies Sam had hidden earlier. Behind them, Sam could hear Morrison saddling his horse and shouting curses that would have made a cavalry sergeant blush. The man was drunk on rage and whiskey, but he was also a skilled tracker and a dangerous adversary. This rescue was only the beginning of what promised to be a long and perilous journey to freedom. Where are we going? Elizabeth asked, her voice steady despite the desperate circumstances. Colorado, Sam replied, guiding Buck along a game trail that would be difficult to follow in the darkness. I know people there who can help us disappear until it's safe to come back. We might never be able to come back, Elizabeth pointed out. Morrison isn't the type to forget or forgive. Sam had considered that possibility, had weighed the risks and accepted that helping Elizabeth might mean giving up the new life he'd started to build in Silver Creek. But, looking at it now, with her warm presence pressed against his back and the promise of redemption finally within reach, he found he didn't care about what he might be leaving behind. Then, we'll make a new life somewhere else, he said. There's a whole country out there, plenty of places where a man and woman can start fresh if they're willing to work hard and watch each other's backs. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what he'd said. When she spoke again, her voice held a note of wonder that touched something deep in Sam's chest. You barely know me. For all you know, I could be exactly what my father claimed I was, a worthless woman who brings nothing but trouble to any man foolish enough to care about her. Your father was wrong, Sam said firmly. You're not property to be bought and sold. You're a human being with the right to choose your own path in life. Nobody has the right to take that away from you. They rode in silence after that, Buck's steady gait carrying them deeper into the wilderness as Morrison's shouts faded behind them. Sam navigated by the stars, following routes he'd scouted during his years of wandering, always staying off the main trails where they might be easily tracked. Every few miles, he would stop and listen for sounds of pursuit, but, so far, the night remained quiet behind them. As they passed the cache where Sam had hidden supplies for the spare horse, Elizabeth asked, How long have you been planning this? Since the night I watched your father lose you in that poker game, Sam admitted. I couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't shake the feeling that I had to do something to help. Most men would have minded their own business, Elizabeth observed. Most men didn't make the same promises I made, Sam replied, then caught himself before he could say more.
This wasn't the time or place to burden Elizabeth with the story of his own losses and regrets. But Elizabeth was perceptive, and Sam's brief comment hadn't escaped her notice. "What promises?" she asked gently. Sam was quiet for so long that Elizabeth began to think he wouldn't answer. Then, as they crested a ridge that gave them a view of the star-swept valley below, he began to speak in the measured tones of a man sharing a burden he'd carried alone for too long. "I was married once," he said. "Her name was Sarah, and she was the best person I ever knew. Kind, gentle, with a laugh that could light up the darkest day. We were going to have a child together, build a life on the ranch we'd bought together. I promised her I'd always protect her, always keep her safe from harm." Elizabeth felt the tension in Sam's body as he continued the painful story. There was an accident. A stagecoach overturned on a muddy road, and Sarah and our unborn baby were killed. I couldn't save them. All my promises, all my plans, all my love, and I couldn't save them when it mattered most. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said softly, and Sam could hear the genuine compassion in her voice. "For 3 years, I've been running from that failure," Sam continued. "Drifting from place to place, trying to find some peace with what happened. But when I saw you that night, saw the fear in your eyes and the hopelessness of your situation, I knew I couldn't run anymore. Maybe I can't bring Sarah back, but I can honor her memory by protecting someone else who needs protection." Elizabeth leaned back against Sam's chest, a gesture of trust and comfort that surprised them both. She must have been a very special woman to inspire such devotion. "She was," Sam agreed. "And I think she would have liked you. You have the same strength, the same refusal to let circumstances break your spirit." They rode on through the night, two wounded souls finding solace in shared purpose and the promise of a new beginning. Behind them, Jake Morrison's cabin grew dark and cold, while ahead lay the uncertain hope of freedom and the chance to build something beautiful from the ashes of their separate tragedies. The rescue was complete, but their real journey was just beginning. And, for the first time since Sarah's death, Sam Hart found himself looking toward the future with something that might have been hope. 6 months after their desperate flight from Silver Creek, Sam Hart stood on the porch of a modest cabin overlooking the Green River Valley in Colorado, watching Elizabeth tend to the garden she'd planted behind their home. The sight of her kneeling among the tomato plants, her auburn hair glinting in the morning sunlight, still took his breath away. Not just because of her beauty, though she remained the most striking woman he'd ever seen, but because of the peace that had settled over her features, the contentment that had replaced the haunted wariness she'd carried during their first weeks together. The journey to this moment had been neither easy nor straightforward. Those first days on the trail, fleeing through the Colorado wilderness with Jake Morrison and his associates somewhere behind them, had tested them both in ways they'd never imagined. Sam's careful planning had gotten them away from immediate danger, but staying ahead of determined pursuers while learning to trust each other had required reserves of strength and courage neither of them had known they possessed. The physical challenges had been significant enough. Late spring in the Colorado mountains meant unpredictable weather, treacherous terrain, and the constant threat of running out of supplies before they reached safety. Sam's years of frontier experience had served them well, but even he had underestimated how difficult it would be to care for a woman unaccustomed to sleeping on the ground and eating whatever game he could catch or roots Elizabeth could identify as edible. But the emotional challenges had been even more daunting. They were virtual strangers thrown together by desperate circumstances, each carrying wounds that made trust difficult and intimacy seem impossible. Sam's grief over Sarah's death remained a constant presence, a shadow that fell between him and any attempt at happiness. Elizabeth's trauma from her father's betrayal and Morrison's captivity had left her jumpy and withdrawn, quick to flinch at unexpected sounds and slow to believe that anyone might want to help her without expecting something in return. For the first month, they'd maintained a careful emotional distance even as they depended on each other for survival. Sam had been scrupulously respectful, setting up separate sleeping areas and taking pains never to touch her except when necessary to help her over difficult terrain. Elizabeth had been grateful but guarded, offering to help with camp chores but rarely initiating conversation beyond the practical necessities of their shared journey. The turning point had come during a 3-day storm that trapped them in a cave high in the mountains, with nothing to do but wait for the weather to clear and try to stay warm. Forced into close quarters with no distractions, they'd finally begun to really talk, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams they'd thought were lost forever. Elizabeth had spoken of her childhood in St. Louis, of piano lessons and books, and a mother who'd read her poetry while they worked together in their garden. She described her father as he'd been before gambling destroyed him, a man who'd carried her on his shoulders and promised her the world. The pain in her voice when she spoke of watching him transform from protector to betrayer had cut Sam to the bone, reminding him of his own failures to protect those he loved. Sam, in turn, had shared more about Sarah, about the ranch they'd built together and the dreams that had died with her in that overturned stagecoach. He'd told Elizabeth about the guilt that had driven him from their home, the conviction that he should have been able to prevent the accident somehow, should have insisted they take a different route or travel on a different day. "You couldn't have known," Elizabeth had said quietly, her voice barely audible over the wind howling outside their shelter. "Some things just happen, no matter how much we love someone or how careful we try to be." "I know that in my head," Sam had replied. "But my heart's a different story. I made her promises I couldn't keep, and she paid the price for my failure." "What would she want for you now?" Elizabeth had asked, and the question had stopped Sam cold. It was something he'd never really considered, too lost in his own guilt and grief to think about what Sarah might have wished for his future. "She'd want me to be happy," he'd admitted after a long pause. "She'd want me to find peace and maybe love again, if I could. She wasn't the jealous type. She always said love multiplied instead of dividing, that caring for one person made you better at caring for others." "Then, maybe honoring her memory means more than just surviving," Elizabeth had suggested. "Maybe it means learning to live again." That conversation had marked the beginning of a new phase in their relationship, a gradual warming that had developed as naturally as spring following winter. They'd started riding closer together, sharing observations about the country they were passing through and the wildlife they encountered. When Elizabeth had caught a fever crossing a swollen river, Sam had nursed her through it with a tenderness that surprised them both, and when he'd been thrown from his horse and badly bruised his ribs, she'd insisted on binding his wounds despite his embarrassed protests. By the time they'd reached the valley where they'd decided to settle, something precious had grown between them, a bond forged from shared hardship and mutual respect that had slowly blossomed into something deeper. The first time Sam had kissed her, standing beside a mountain stream while she washed their clothes, they'd both been trembling with more than cold. "I don't want to dishonor Sarah's memory," he'd whispered against her lips, his voice rough with emotion and desire. "You're not," Elizabeth had whispered back. "Love isn't betrayal, Sam. Love is the greatest honor you can give to someone's memory." They'd married 6 weeks later, in a simple ceremony performed by a circuit preacher in the town of Riverside, 30 miles down the valley from their homestead. Sam had bought Elizabeth a simple gold band with money earned from selling horses to local ranchers, and she'd worn a dress of blue calico that brought out the green in her eyes. It hadn't been the grand wedding either of them might have dreamed of in their youth, but it had been perfect in its simplicity and sincerity. The life they'd built together was modest but rich in the things that truly mattered. Sam had found work with a large ranch outfit that valued his experience with horses, while Elizabeth had established herself as a seamstress and occasional piano teacher for the families in the valley. They'd bought their cabin and 20 acres from a widow who was moving back east to live with her daughter, and they'd spent the summer making it truly their own. Elizabeth's garden was flourishing under her careful attention, providing them with vegetables and herbs that made their simple meals feel like feasts. Sam had built a small barn for their horses and started a modest breeding program, using his knowledge and reputation to gradually establish himself as a man to be trusted with valuable livestock. They attended church on Sundays, participated in community barn raisings and harvest festivals, and slowly became part of the fabric of frontier life in the Green River Valley. But perhaps the most precious thing about their new life was the peace they'd found in each other's presence. Sam no longer woke in the middle of the night, haunted by dreams of overturned stagecoaches and promises he couldn't keep. Elizabeth no longer flinched when men spoke to her, no longer carried herself with the defensive wariness of someone expecting betrayal at any moment. They'd healed each other's wounds through patience and understanding, through countless small acts of kindness and consideration. There had been challenges, of course. The first winter had been particularly difficult, with supplies running low and temperatures dropping far below anything either of them had experienced. they'd worried constantly about Jake Morrison or his associates tracking them down, and every stranger who rode through the valley had been viewed with suspicion until his business was established as legitimate. There had also been the more subtle challenge of learning to be married to each other, of negotiating the thousand small compromises that made shared life possible. Sam had been a bachelor for 3 years and had grown accustomed to making decisions without consultation. Elizabeth had spent so many years having her choices made for her that she sometimes struggled to voice her own preferences. But they'd worked through these difficulties with the same determination that had carried them through their dangerous journey, talking honestly about their needs and fears and finding solutions that honored both their perspectives. Now, watching Elizabeth work in their garden while their horses grazed peacefully in the pasture beyond, Sam felt a contentment he thought was lost forever. The sharp edge of grief for Sarah had softened into a gentle sadness that no longer dominated his every waking moment. He would always love her, would always carry the memory of their time together, but that love no longer felt like a barrier to new happiness. Instead, it had become a foundation upon which he'd built something even stronger with Elizabeth. As if sensing his thoughts, Elizabeth looked up from her plants and smiled, the expression transforming her face with a radiance that never failed to move him. She stood and walked toward the porch, brushing soil from her hands and pushing a strand of hair back from her face. "The tomatoes are coming along beautifully," she said, settling into the chair beside him and taking his hand in hers. "We'll have enough to can for the winter, with plenty left over to trade with the neighbors." Sam squeezed her fingers gently, marveling again at how perfectly her small hand fit in his larger one. "Mrs. Patterson was asking yesterday if you'd be willing to teach her daughter piano," he said. "Seems the girl's been pestering her parents ever since she heard you playing at the church social." Elizabeth smiled at the prospect. She discovered that teaching music brought her almost as much joy as playing for her own pleasure, and the small income from lessons helped with their household expenses. "I'd be happy to teach her. It's been too long since I had a student who was genuinely excited about learning." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun climb higher over the mountains that surrounded their valley. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily on the thermal currents, and, closer to the cabin, a pair of wrens were building a nest in the eaves of the barn. It was the kind of perfect morning that made all their struggles seem worthwhile, a moment of pure contentment that neither of them took for granted. "Do you ever regret it?" Elizabeth asked suddenly, her voice soft but serious. "Giving up your old life to help a stranger? You could have stayed in Silver Creek, built a good life there without all the complications I brought with me." Sam turned to study her face, seeing the genuine concern in her green eyes. Even after all these months, she sometimes struggled to believe that she was worth the risks he'd taken and the sacrifices he'd made. It was a legacy of the years she'd spent being treated as a burden and a commodity, and he suspected it would take many more months of love and reassurance before she fully accepted her own worth. "Elizabeth," he said gently, "you didn't complicate my life. You saved it. Before I met you, I was just existing, going through the motions of living without any real purpose or joy. You gave me a reason to fight, a reason to hope, a reason to believe that maybe I deserved happiness after all. Even though it meant running away from everything you'd started to build?" Sam considered the question seriously, thinking about the modest room above Tom McGrath's livery stable, the job hauling her wagons, the careful routine he'd established to keep his grief at bay. "What I was building in Silver Creek wasn't a life," he said finally. "It was just a way of marking time until I died. What we have here, this is a life worth living." Elizabeth leaned over and kissed him softly, a gesture of gratitude and love that sent warmth spreading through his chest. "I love you, Samuel Hart," she whispered against his lips. "More than I ever thought I could love anyone." "And I love you, Elizabeth Hart," he replied, savoring the sound of her married name. "More than I thought my heart was capable of after losing Sarah. But you were right that day in the cave. Love multiplies instead of dividing. Loving you doesn't diminish what I felt for her, it proves that the heart is capable of healing and growing stronger." As they held each other on the porch of their mountain cabin, Sam reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. A poker game in a frontier saloon, a desperate gamble that had changed 3 lives forever. Marcus Porter had lost his daughter and his last claim to respectability, disappearing into the night to face whatever consequences awaited a man who'd gambled away everything including his own soul. Jake Morrison had lost his prize and his leverage, reportedly fleeing the territory when it became clear that local sentiment had turned against him and his criminal associates. But Sam and Elizabeth had won something infinitely more precious than any pot of gold or silver. They'd won each other, and, in doing so, they'd won back their faith in the possibility of happiness. Two broken people had found wholeness in their shared love, had discovered that redemption was possible even for those who thought they'd lost everything worth having. As the morning sun climbed higher and the day's work beckoned, Sam knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. There would be hard winters and difficult seasons, times when money was tight and worries pressed down like storm clouds. There might even come a day when their past caught up with them, when they'd have to run again or fight for the life they'd built. But, whatever came, they would meet it with the strength they'd found in each other and the love that had transformed them both from wanderers into partners, from survivors into people who truly lived. The gambler's daughter had been won, but not by the man who'd thought he owned her. She'd been won by someone who saw her true value and was willing to risk everything to give her the freedom to choose her own fate. And, in saving her, Sam Hart had discovered something he'd thought was lost forever, the possibility of a love that honored the past while embracing the future, a love that proved that sometimes the greatest gambles led to the most beautiful victories. Standing on their porch in the Colorado mountains, surrounded by the life they'd built together from nothing but hope and determination, they knew they were the richest people in the world.